Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Susie Creamer. I am Center Director at Patterson Park Audubon Center in beautiful Baltimore, Maryland. And we are here to share with you this important message that I talk about often as collective conservation, that each of us, no matter how small or paved your patch may be, if you can tend to it in a way, plant the right things and cultivate it in a way that is beneficial for birds, that adds up. That's a lot of us with a lot of land when you tally it all up. Even if you've got a balcony or a stoop, whatever you've got, do grow it for birds. So I'm tasked with a few logistical items for the evening. We are recording the webinar, and you will receive a copy of that recording afterward, or rather a link to it. The webinar will go 90 minutes in terms of Erin's presentation. So she will be talking much of the time, and I will be managing the chat, which means if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat during that time. So you'll stay on mute, as Erin said already. I've muted everyone a few minutes ago, so do stay muted. But use the chat, ask questions. We ask that you stay relevant with your questions, be on topic. There are many things to ask about many wonderful things, but we do want to talk about plants for birds in this session. So specifically, we'll be talking about native plants, as Erin will tell you, focused on largely the mid-Atlantic in terms of specific species, but the message is the same anywhere in the world in terms of thinking about those natives and how to grow your space, why to grow your space for birds. So do try to stay focused in the chat and be patient, because I will be responding to the group chat as well as individuals messaging me privately, and that's fine. Don't message Erin privately, because she will be giving the presentation and not looking at the chat. But periodically she'll stop and ask if there are any questions, so I can feed her some, but I can also address them in the chat, so I don't have to feed her every question. So I'll manage that. And if you think it's a question that could benefit all, do ask it to everyone. And there's shared expertise, of course. Let's remember that many of you may have experience with a question that's being asked, so you can chime in with your own wisdom and expertise. So there is no official break, so if you need one, do take one. And again, the webinar is being recorded, and the follow-up email that you will receive will have the link to the recording, as well as a handful of other helpful links to resources that we'll mention throughout. There will also be a link to the survey that you'll hopefully take for us afterward. Give us your honest feedback, and do visit some of those resources that we'll provide, which are many of them housed on our website in terms of the best plants for birds for this area and much more. If you have a garden in Maryland or DC, you can apply for the sign that we managed specifically through Patterson Park Audubon Center. And so I'll be sure to include that link in the chat. You can click on it and it opens in your web browser. You can look at it tomorrow or later, but you'll have it. It'll also be in that email to follow up. So do get your sign on the map. Erin will talk a bit about that. Get your garden on the map, I should say. For those in Pennsylvania, I can also include that link. And I know folks are coming from a few other parts of the country and beyond, and that's wonderful. We welcome you. And there are perhaps other Audubon programs in your area if you want to get a sign to reward yourself for all that hard work for planting for birds and butterflies. So other action items you can do is support Patterson Park Audubon Center. We love offering these programs free and open to the public, but we do rely on supporters like you. It's pretty awesome to be part of National Audubon Society, but we do have to raise all of our funds locally. So keep that in mind, and if you're able to be generous, we appreciate it. Do join us for another webinar. Erin will talk about the kind of next level webinar that we offer. Erin, is there still room in that one that's in May?
Yes.
Speak out of turn. Great.
Yep.
The 13th, I think it is. I can send a link to that too. All these things, remind me in the chat. And do pass along the word and encourage a friend or neighbor to join, and think of yourselves, hopefully after today, as an ambassador of sorts for this important message that we have to share. So with that, again, I'm Susie Creamer. Nice to meet you all. I'll be in the chat. I'll see you in the chat. And Erin, I will turn it over to you.
All right. I'm going to switch our spotlight. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. At least here in Baltimore, it's kind of a rainy, drizzly night, which I actually sort of prefer. I always feel kind of badly when we do these workshops and it's so sunny outside. Like, you could all be out in your garden right now. So it's kind of a dreary night, and what better thing to do than think about all the different ways that we are going to improve our landscapes. So I'm really thrilled that we're able to join us wherever you are right now. It was so exciting to see all the different places where you're joining us from. I will say that of all of the Audubon centers across the nation, we are the only one that doesn't actually have a visitor center. We have a business office where we have our desks and storage and things, but we are very much used to meeting folks where they are. We meet our students outside in Patterson Park or in their schools, or we partner with libraries or other organizations to host our workshops. And so when we were forced out of, our meeting places, our in-person meeting places, it was a transition, but I think it actually opened up this exciting new avenue for us to meet folks where they are. So I'm so thrilled that everybody's able to join us tonight. So I just wanted to quickly mention again that this is an introductory workshop. I'm sure among the 130 so of us present tonight, there is probably a wide variety of experiences and expertise, but we are going to start with the basics tonight. And I'm going to give you kind of the theory behind what it means to plant for birds and other wildlife. And so keep that in mind. So before I get any farther, I am actually going to show just a quick video, 3 minutes. I know we can make it through that. Just to offer an introduction to who we are, why we're here, give you all a glimpse into iconic Patterson Park, a bird's eye view of that 150-acre urban oasis, and kick off what you all can do to help share our spaces with birds and wildlife. So take a look or a listen. Ooh. Going back, here we go. Okay, it's just like being here. So, as a little bit of a background as to who we are, Susie mentioned that we are Patterson Park Audubon Center. We are part of National Audubon Society, which is an international nonprofit organization focused on protecting birds in particular, but more generally protecting bird habitats and where birds live. And the spoiler that I like to give to my younger students is that birds live everywhere. So that kind of means protecting all the places where we are, which is great because those are the places that we have control over. Those are the places that we can make decisions about. Now, you might notice that I am already talking a lot about birds, and perhaps that doesn't surprise you being that we are Audubon. But this workshop is called a wildlife gardening workshop. And so I wanted to point out that, birds share the same support system with all of that other wildlife that you might be trying to lure to your gardens. But birds are also a really great surrogate for the rest of the food web, if you think about it, because there are birds that are herbivores like goldfinches. There are birds that are omnivores. There are birds that are strictly carnivorous. There are birds that are scavengers. They act as decomposers. And so by managing our landscapes to be fit for birds, we're also managing them to be fit for the rest of the food web, which of course includes people. We can't ignore the people aspect of this. And so while we want our gardens to be beneficial, we also want them to be beautiful. So hopefully that's why you're all here. We share this message through lots of different avenues. I would say in the before times, we would do over 500 programs every year with over 13,000 folks of every age and background. We do free bird watching tours throughout Baltimore. We have a bilingual Tiny Tots programs for 2 to 5-year-olds. Lots of school field trips where kids are walking with their classes into Patterson Park. That's that bottom center image there, meeting a tree. And then, workshops like this for adults, which we do publicly open to all of you, but also for garden clubs and things like that. We love volunteers as we're executing all of these programs as well. So normally when we have these workshops in person, I like to hear from everybody. We're normally talking about the different Baltimore neighborhoods where we're from, trying to get a little synergy going. In this, format, we can't obviously do that, but I would like to hear from you just a little bit. And so I do actually have a couple of poll questions that I'm going to open up. And the first one, very simple. And I know that some folks already told us where they're from in the chat, but we are curious to know where you're from. So if you are here in Baltimore along with us, whether you are in Maryland, but outside of Baltimore, maybe you are in the Mid-Atlantic, but outside of Maryland, maybe you are outside of the Mid-Atlantic, but still in the US, or maybe you're outside the US. I know I saw a couple folks who are joining us from our neighbor to the north. So go ahead and punch which one is correct for you. Looks like about 70% or so of you have entered your answer. So I'll close the poll in about 3 seconds. 2, 1. Okay, so let's take a look. Looks like almost 50% of us are here from the Mid-Atlantic, followed closely by folks who are here in Maryland, so that's exciting. But also a good handful of folks who are here from outside of this area and even outside the US, so that's very exciting. I'm going to share exactly why that's so exciting in just a second, but I have one more question to ask you, at least for now. And that is about what kind of garden space you have. And on this question, you can actually check all that apply. So are you gardening in containers? You just have plants potted on a patio or a rooftop deck, something like that. Maybe you have a small yard, less than 1/4 of an acre. I actually learned recently that the average lawn size in the US is right about 1/4 of an acre. So less than 1/4 of an acre is actually not small. It's average. More than 1/4 of an acre, more than an acre, that's really large. And then maybe you're also thinking about other places where you garden, such as schools, maybe your children's schools, or at a place of business, or in your community. We actually have several Audubon recognized gardens in Maryland at like public gardens. So that's exciting. Or maybe you are just here trying to broaden your horizons, but you don't actually garden yet at all. You are aspirational. Looks like most folks have voted, so I'm going to end the poll in 3, 2, 1, and share our results. So this is exciting, and we have folks who are gardening, you know, all over the spectrum. Lots of folks gardening in containers, which is really exciting. And then, you know, a variety of yard sizes, some folks gardening at schools and businesses. That's really, really awesome. So I'm going to show lots of different examples of all of these different places. But suffice to say, it matters because they all add up. So let me close this. Okay. And, you know, the reason that this is so important and so impactful is because you all represent this amazingly vast network of gardeners, each with a similar purpose. You know, lots of people garden for lots of different reasons, ornamental value, maybe food to eat and things like that. But you are all here because you want your gardens to make a difference, which is something that we can actually do and something that is absolutely imperative for these billions of birds, which tend not to stay in one place. It would be so much easier if they just stayed in one place and we could give them what they need and protect them. But many, many birds migrate. And so they may only see your garden for a very short period of time before they have to move along their migratory journeys. This map is really neat because it shows some of the different pathways that birds take while they're migrating. These pathways are called flyways. But of course, underneath those flyways are really critical stopover habitats, places where birds need to stop and rest and refuel. So here in the Atlantic Flyway, anybody who said that they're here in Maryland or Pennsylvania or Virginia, guess what? We're all seeing the same birds. And I don't just mean the same bird species, I mean the same individual bird might land in my garden, might land in your garden. And that's such a cool thing to think about, how all of our gardens can add up along this, you know, extended habitat that birds have. I will brag a little bit about the Atlantic Flyway. We are home to some of the world's most productive ecosystems. Just think about the Chesapeake Bay, largest estuary in the entire United States. We're also home to about 1/3 of the US population. Okay, so lots of human-dominated land along this very important migratory route for lots and lots of birds. You might not have billions of birds stopping at your garden. Maybe you just have one. Maybe you might have this bird stop in your garden. So this bird you may recognize, especially if you're in DC. It's your state bird. Sorry, you're not a state. I'm putting it in air quotes. I wish you were. But the wood thrush is a bird that might not be recognized by appearance. It might be recognized by sound. So let's take a listen. That beautiful ole, 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 ole. So this is a bird that you might hear brightening up the forest with its song very shortly this time of year. This bird, the wood thrush, is a neotropical migratory bird. And so that means that it is just as comfortable among the toucans and the howler monkeys in Costa Rica as it is here in our deciduous forests. This wood thrush, this individual wood thrush right here, it spends its winters in Central America. And then right about this time of year, this wood thrush, this individual wood thrush, which weighs about 40 grams, so about the weight of 15 pennies, if you can imagine the weight of 15 pennies in your hands, it will start to fly it'll start to migrate, and it will actually fly across the Gulf of Mexico in a single night. And, along with most birds, this wood thrush will be migrating at night, but once it travels along the Atlantic flyway, it starts to see something that might be a little distracting. So birds typically use stars and constellations in order to navigate and orient themselves. And so when they look down and they see all these lights from our cities and suburbs, they can actually be lured to those places and become disoriented by those bright lights. Once they find themselves in a brightly lit space, like in a city, that wood thrush might circle and fly around disoriented until it's so exhausted that it absolutely has to land. And hopefully our wood thrush lands somewhere like this. This is actually Susie's garden, but this is a bird-friendly garden in Baltimore City. You never know where that wood thrush is going to land. So hopefully it lands somewhere like this. It can find the shelter it needs. It can find the food it needs, some water that will allow it to, rest and recuperate a little bit before it flies the next 100 miles. Now, I don't like to dwell on doom and gloom. I know we are all here to do something positive, but sadly, that is not the case for some of our wood thrushes, which are actually declining by about 2% every year. They've declined by about half over the past 50 years. And that is the case for about 41% of all neotropical migratory songbirds. And so we have this phrase called birds tell us. Birds can't speak, of course, but birds are sending us a message. They are our proverbial canaries in the coal mine, and they are telling us that it's time to act. And like I mentioned at the very outset, we rely on the same support system as does the rest of the food web. And so we need to listen when birds like our wood thrush are giving us a message. And so that's why we're here. There's so much that we can do individually. And of course, all of that adds up into that collective conservation action. So let's start with the basics. We're going to go through just the building blocks of a habitat, starting with food. We're going to talk a lot about food, but mostly what we're here to talk about is native plants and how they provide birds with the 4 bird food groups. We get a lot of questions during these workshops about feeders, and feeders are great. Feeders are great for viewing and appreciating birds, but they don't give birds everything that they need. And we're going to talk more about why that is on the next slide. But the bottom line is that our gardens should really be our bird feeders, and those feeders can supplement them. So there are lots of different resources that you can find online if you want to find out some more information about feeders. For tonight, for the purposes of our workshop, we're going to focus on the gardens. So in addition to food, of course, birds, just like every other living thing, need water, not just for drinking, but also for cooling off in the summer and maintaining their feathers. It's really important, just like your bird feeders, to keep those bird baths and other water sources clean. And we get questions about, how to keep mosquitoes out of them. Happy to answer that during our Q&A if folks want to hear about that. But this doesn't have to be, a painful process. I usually kind of spray mine out with the hose. Usually the water evaporates before I get a chance to anyway. We know that this year there was actually a disease going around to some of our birds, specifically our finches. And so it can be important every once in a while, at least once a season, to take those feeders and bird baths inside and actually give them a good cleaning. We also need to make sure that our gardens provide shelter. So thinking about the density of our plants, whether there are evergreen plants so that they have shelter all year round. I like to point out that our little birds need protection from predators, but our predatory birds also need somewhere to hide so that they can sneak up on their prey. We're doing a whole food web thing here, so we can't forget about our predators. And then of course, nesting sites. And these need to be protected places, free from other threats that we will talk about in a minute. So those are essentially the building blocks to an Audubon recognized bird-friendly habitat. And something, the things that you'll need to actually earn your Baltimore Orioles sign if you are in Maryland or DC. So I'm going to talk a lot more about what it actually means to be a bird-friendly habitat, but I do want to ask all of you right now whether you think, before hearing the rest of the information I realize, but whether you think right now your garden is bird-friendly. What do you think? Yes, no, or you're not sure? Okay, looks like most folks have entered their answer. So I'm going to end the poll, and I don't like to just do it suddenly. So I'm going to give you 3 seconds, 2, 1. See, a couple people sneak their answers in there. All right, let's close that up and share with you. This is always so exciting. Most people think that your garden is bird friendly, which is great. A few of you think no, a few of you are not sure. And so that's what we're going to spend pretty much the next hour trying to figure out, right? All right, so I said that we were going to talk a lot about food and what it means to provide food for birds. And I mentioned that it doesn't just mean putting up a bird feeder. And that's because most birds eat a variety of foods throughout the year and throughout their life cycle. So birds are eating different things all the time. Very few birds which exclusively eat, seeds. So let's go through each of these food groups. I have our bird food pyramid here, starting with the berries. So berries are the first example that I will give about how plants are really smart. So plants, of course, can't reproduce the same way that animals do, but they still need to be able to disperse their seeds out into the world. And so they pack their seeds inside this fatty, sweet treat. And plants that are native to a region have the production of these fatty, sweet seed treats timed perfectly to coincide with when birds are migrating, right? Because birds will come along, eat that fatty sweet treat, fly off, disperse their seed, and there you go. The plant just reproduced. And of course, that's really important for the birds too. Berries are not all created equal. Different species have varying levels of fat and other nutrients in them. And it turns out that native plants that are native to a particular region, have lots more fat during the times when birds need them. And that fat is what fuels birds' migration. Next food group is the seeds. So seeds have all of those minerals and nutrients that birds need. Think about how nuts are a superfood for humans, right? Because they have really healthy fats and lots of minerals and things that keep us healthy. Those nutrients also last a long time in birds' bodies. They don't get burned off right away. And so it's a really good idea to leave those seed heads up on your dead flowers all throughout the winter when birds like our resident goldfinches are going to need them. Nectar, as a food group, of course, it supports our pollinators, and those pollinators a lot of times can then be food for birds. And then, of course, we have our bird pollinator, our hummingbirds. And so lots of people, of course, like to plant plants specifically for pollinators. As a food group, they're kind of a sweet treat, but in your landscape design, these flower-producing plants, these nectar-producing plants are so important. It's where you get all of your color, right? And your fragrance, all of the beautiful things about your garden. So for both of those reasons, the ecological reason as well as the design reason, we want to make sure that there's something blooming as long as possible, this overlapping sequence of blooms all the way from spring until fall. And then I saved the best food group for last, the insects. So when I ask my elementary school age students, what do birds eat? They always say things like worms and seeds. And the one I really hate is when they say bread. And I have to remind them that actually 96% of terrestrial bird species, so birds that live on the land, eat insects, at least at some point in their life. So 96%, almost every single kind of bird species is going to eat insects at some point in their life. And that is because insects are packed with protein. Pound for pound, more protein than beef. Some insects by dry weight are up to 75% protein. That's amazing. And so birds need those insects in order to build up their bodies, right? And to be strong and healthy. In particular, when birds are feeding nestlings in the spring and summer, they are looking for insects to feed them, okay? They're probably not feeding them things like seeds and berries. And among the insects that they are looking for, they are specifically trying to find caterpillars in a lot of cases. And that's because caterpillars, in addition to all that protein, also are really slurpy slidey to help them get swallowed by baby birds. And caterpillars have 2 times as many carotenoids as other kinds of insects. And these carotenoids are antioxidants, so they make birds healthier. They boost their health. They also aid in boosting the pigmentation of their feathers, okay? And as we know, birds use the colors of their feathers to do lots of things, right? They're signaling to their neighbors, they're attracting mates especially. And so if you leave tonight only remembering one thing, I hope that it's this, that caterpillars equal sexy birds, okay? If you wanna have sexy, beautiful, colorful birds, you need caterpillars. And if you wanna have caterpillars, you need native plants, okay? In general, if you want insects, we need native plants. So I've said this word native plants a few times and I haven't defined it yet. And there are lots of different definitions of this word. We could go down a major native plants rabbit hole trying to come up with all the definitions and distinguishing between naturalized plants and invasive non-native plants and all of those things. Suffice to say, non-native plants provide lots of the same ecological services that native plants do. They produce oxygen, they clean our air, they soak up and filter our water, they provide shade, they do all of these great things. The one thing that they don't do is they do not provide the ecological service of supporting our food chain. And the reason for that is actually the second reason why plants are really smart. So plants, of course, don't want their leaves to be eaten. They want their seeds to be eaten and dispersed, but they don't want their leaves to be eaten. And so they defend themselves, they pack their leaves. I'm acting like they have a choice or they have a power to do this, but their leaves are packed with these nasty chemicals. And it takes a really long time, like evolutionary time, for insects to develop the ability to digest those chemicals. It's called specialization. And so, over co-evolutionary time, insects are adapting the ability to digest the chemicals in plants with which they are co-evolving. And a great example of that kind of specialization is this insect right here. So I'm not trying to blow up the chat. I know Susie always hates when I do this, but I will give 50 brownie points to whoever can identify the insect in this photo by typing it into the chat. Got my brownie points. They're all warm right out of the oven. Oh, there it is. Valerie got it. Really good job, everybody. So yes, this caterpillar is a monarch butterfly larva. Okay, it's a caterpillar. It's going to turn into a monarch butterfly. And this monarch butterfly caterpillar is a perfect example of a very specialized insect because it is only adapted to eat one group of plants. Oh, Roxana, she got it with the Asclepias tuberosa. Exactly. So monarch caterpillars are only able to digest the chemicals in milkweed plants. Okay, this is an example of specialization. So these native plants are our link between the sun and the rest of the food chain. And most often that food chain starts with an insect. I will mention for our bee lovers out there that 25% of our native bees are actually also specialists. They are morphologically adapted. I'm going to get real nerdy on us right now. Morphologically adapted, which means their bodies are shaped in order to only be able to go into one flower. Oh my gosh, it's the third example of how plants are so smart. Flowers don't want their pollen to get wasted getting spread to any old flower out there. And so over coevolutionary time, flowers adapted to only be able to fit in one kind of bee. And so that bee can only go into that kind of flower, and then it can only go to the next bloom of that same species of flower. So 25% of our bees are specialists, and 90% of our herbivorous insects in general are specialists. So very important that we have native plants to support all of these native insects. When we plant something like a milkweed or a wildflower garden like this, we are in effect restoring this ancient food web. I keep looking at my closed captions and wondering if I'm speaking clearly. So I hope that I am, and I hope it's capturing that.
You're great, and it even got morphologically correct.
Wow.
Keep up the good work, you and the
Makes me want to say morphologically more often. So
go for it.
Here are two plants that we could plant, right? When we plant something like Nandina, this plant on the left, very common ornamental plant, non-native, it's called heavenly bamboo. So if that gives you a clue. When we plant Nandina, we are supporting exactly 0 species of our native insects. It's basically pest-free. That's what the horticultural industry will tell you. This is a pest-free plant. That also means that it's food web free. It's not supporting anything. It might as well be made of plastic. I'm just kidding. It does do those other ecological services that I mentioned. It's filtering water and da-da-da-da-da. But if we plant vaccinium, like our blueberries and our cranberries, we are supporting almost 300 different species of insects. And then of course, the amazingly complex array of food webs that comes out from all of those species. So you are doing a huge service to our food web just by choosing native plants. Don't worry, though, that when you plant those native plants, they're going to get destroyed by all of those caterpillars, because you are basically building in a natural pesticide called natural enemies. It's called biocontrol. And so insects are this critical link between the sun and plants and the rest of the food web. Without insects, we wouldn't have the rest of these animals. So of course we love our birds, but insects are also going to get eaten by reptiles like turtles and frogs and mammals and fish and lizards and people. Like I said, pound for pound more protein than beef, livestock of the future. You heard it here first. Other insects, bats, spiders, you're creating a food web, okay? Without native plants, we don't have insects. Without insects, we don't have pretty much anything else. If you're not yet convinced, I know I'm giving you a lot of background information, but this is the introductory workshop, and I'm expecting you all to memorize everything that I say so that you can all be habitat ambassadors in your various locales. And so if you need some other benefits of native gardening that extend beyond the food web, we know that planting in this way means lower maintenance for you, the gardener, not no maintenance. There is no such thing as a no maintenance garden. But these plants are evolved to thrive where you live. And so that means less watering and less weeding if you plant plants closely to each other, just like in a meadow or a forest. And so you're conserving resources, you're reducing the amount of maintenance that you'll have to do. Who likes spending their weekend riding a lawnmower or pushing a lawnmower anyway? Less fertilizing, less pesticides, which of course we know not only protects our wild spaces, but also protects the health of you and your family. We also want to plant native plants as opposed to non-native plants because we want to prevent invasive plant infestation. We want to maintain the ability of our indigenous plants to reproduce, which they cannot do very well when they're covered with English ivy, like in this photograph. We want to prevent these new infestations of invasive plants and disease, which I should clarify doesn't always happen overnight. You know, an invasive plant doesn't just like, boom, flip the switch, I'm invasive now. It can take decades or even centuries for a non-native plant to escape cultivation and start wreaking havoc on our wild spaces. Most invasive plants were introduced as ornamental plants. Okay, and so when you go to your big box store nurseries and you see the euonymus, and I saw English ivy at a store I will not mention recently, just like drives me crazy. But just keep in mind, if you're planting natives, then you know you're not planting something that can do this. So that's a good thing. We also want to plant native plants because they help us preserve our regional aesthetic identity and sense of place. So here in Maryland, we know that it's fall when the black-eyed Susans bloom, and we want to keep it that way. There are always, gardens and if I wanted to see desert plants or rainforest plants, I would go to the Rawlings Conservatory and the arboretums and see the plants there. But in our natural spaces, we want to have that sense of place. And of course, we also want to attract all the beneficial wildlife that's going to do all of the ecological services that we all rely on: pollination and seed dispersal and air and water filtration and erosion control. And of course, maintaining that healthy web of life. Da-da-da. So speaking of the healthy web of life, speaking of biocontrol, I will mention this bird, which does something incredible. And again, just a surrogate for the rest of the birds and other animals that are doing this exact same thing. So in 16 days, the amount of time that it takes for a chickadee to rear a clutch of baby chickadees, so then the time that it takes for them to hatch and then fledge the nest, in those 16 days, this chickadee, well, maybe I should get some guesses. Do people know this answer yet? Maybe type it into the chat. How many caterpillars do you think will be eaten by this clutch of baby chickadees in the time it takes for them to fledge the nest? About 16 days. I'm going to open up our chat and see if we have any answers. I see 6,000, 1,300, 450. Yeah, when I ask my students, they're like 20. Yeah, so you're right, like thousands. In 16 days, the chickadee will bring some 4,800 caterpillars to its nest to raise that clutch of chicks, okay? I've also seen estimates of up to 9,000. So it's amazing. You plant native plants, they come, they eat the insects, everybody's happy. Before I get into removing the threats in our bird-friendly gardens, I wanted to pause and see if there are any questions.
Yes, I'm so glad you did. There's just one question that is, I was debating whether to interrupt because it's timely. The person was asking, how do pesticides and insecticides affect the environment? What's our messaging around that? And I think that's just for you to dig in a bit more on that, since you're talking about birds as as pest control. And
yes,
the person also mentioned resources about that messaging where we might find some. So if you can add that piece, but at the very least, we should all know what we should do and not do with chemicals.
Yes. Okay. So, and you just said pesticides and herbicides. You didn't say, did you say fertilizers?
I'm sorry.
Also?
I apologize. She actually asked pesticides and insecticides specifically.
Pesticides and insecticides.
As many as you would like. Mm-hmm.
So, pesticides is kind of this larger term, meaning any kind of chemical that we add to eradicate something. Okay, so there are herbicides, that's a pesticide that kills plants. There are insecticides, that's a pesticide that kills insects. All of them, are made of poison. So yeah, when we put them on our landscape, they are absorbed into the ground and they get, filtered out with our rainwater. There are reports of pesticides being linked to childhood leukemia. So we know that that's bad. And then of course, we know that our water doesn't just stay in our landscape. When it precipitates, I can say, here in Baltimore, it goes into our storm drains, it goes into Baltimore Harbor, it goes into the Chesapeake Bay, and it goes into the ocean, okay? everybody lives uphill from somewhere. Everybody lives downhill from somewhere. And so, of course, we don't want to put any of these chemicals into our environment. There are organic pesticides, and something that I mentioned during our more advanced workshop is all of the different methods that you might have to take in order to replace whatever is planted where you're trying to build a bird-friendly garden with native plants. You have to get rid of what's already there first. And there are lots and lots of different methods on how to do that. I don't want to get like too far down a rabbit hole on this workshop on how to remove various species of invasive plants, because there are lots of different methods. So my advice, if that is something that you're wondering about, is to look up your local extension office and their website. I can say that here in Maryland, the University of Maryland Extension website has a super thorough and helpful list with pictures of all the different weeds and invasive plants, and then their specific methods for removal. And maybe that is a manual removal method. Maybe there is a chemical removal method, but there are very careful ways and very specifically timed ways on how to do that. And there are organic ways on how to do that. So I realize I'm speaking really broadly, but that's because there's lots of different options. And so maybe that's something that we can come back to if people have sort of more specific questions during the Q&A at the very end. But yeah, of course, our overall messaging is that anything that we put into the environment doesn't just stay there. It's going to get absorbed by plants, it's going to get eaten by animals, and it's going to get washed out by precipitation.
Thank you so much. That's the only question for now. So keep the questions coming and we'll pause again later.
Great. Yeah, in terms of like resources, I'm going to have to think about that more specifically, like if Audubon has a page specifically about pesticides. If somebody finds that, let us know. Okay, so we know that planting a density of native plants is the biggest positive impact that you can have, but bird-friendly homes also have to remove threats to birds. And so this section of the presentation is otherwise known as how not to kill birds. You want them to come to your garden. You don't want them to die when they get there. And so lots of different ways that we can help to remove their threats. The biggest way, perhaps, is by keeping cats indoors. And I know that this can be a very contentious subject. We end up talking about it at every workshop. Just, be friendly to your neighbors. But it is a fact that outdoor cats kill up to 4 billion, with a B, birds every single year in North America. And it's not because they're mean, this is like an instinctive thing. And so there are some solutions to this. There are some that are really creative, things like catios, building an outdoor enclosure for your cat. I can tell you that bells on collars don't work, but some of these kind of colorful collars do. There's a lot of research on that you can look up, and perhaps folks might offer some advice in the chat. But we just know that keeping cats indoors is safer for birds, also safer for your cat. We also need to address the reflectivity of the glass in our landscape. It is not a thing for birds to fly into the tops of skyscrapers, while they're migrating. Most window strikes actually happen in the first and second floors of a building. And that is because that is where windows are reflecting the surrounding landscape. So, when you and I look at this image, our brains know that this is a reflection of a tree and not a real tree. But when a bird sees this, it thinks it's a tree. And so it tries to fly into that tree. And so we want to make sure that we break up that reflection. We're putting all these new plants into our gardens. We want to make sure that that landscape isn't reflected in our windows in a way that birds think that they can fly into it or through it. So there are some creative solutions. This is an installation at the Creative Alliance in the Highlandtown neighborhood of the Highlandtown neighborhood of Baltimore, where an artist named Lynn Parks actually cut bird silhouettes out of a product called Kaleidoscape and adhered them to the outside of the window. So the left side is what you see from outside. The right side is what you see from inside. They're semi-transparent, okay? You are still going to see them, but it's not, you know, as kind of cluttered as what you see from the outside. That's where you want it to be kind of cluttered so that birds can see it and don't run into it. A maybe more subtle option is this product, which is called Feather Friendly. It comes in a roll of tape, which spaces these little tiny dots exactly 2 inches apart. And that is very critical. You know, these windows that you see with like one raptor silhouette in the corner of the window, that's not doing anything. I'm really sorry, but that's not doing anything because birds will just fly around it. So when we break up the reflection, we have to stick to this rule of 2 inches vertically by 4 inches horizontally. Anything larger than that, and you know, a bird shape, it thinks it can fly through. So Feather Friendly is really handy. This is what it looks from the outside. This is how it looks from the inside. Basically imperceptible to the eye. So I know that people are wary about putting anything on their windows. They want you, of course, we all want to be able to see outside. I live in a city. I can tell you that I want to be able to see outside. But this is a really, really critical investment that I hope that you will consider making in order to protect birds from window strikes. If you need a little bit more motivation, I'm going to tell an ultra sad story. And the reason that I tell this ultra sad story is because, you know, when I get folks applications to get their bird friendly habitat sign, I will say the number one thing that people neglect to do is exactly this, is address the reflectivity of their windows. And it's because they all, you know, everybody thinks the same thing. I thought the same thing. My windows are dirty, they're small, there's screens on half the windows. I live in a city, like nothing's, you know, birds aren't gonna fly into it. Until last spring, when we all started working from home and I was awoken by this horrifying thud against my window and found a dead Swainson's thrush on my roof. And it really like killed me and got me thinking about how important it is to address this issue, even if you think your windows are small or dirty, or you live in an urban area, or you've never seen any dead birds outside of it. It can happen. And there was no reason for that Swainson's thrush to die. It was a perfectly healthy bird. It could have gone on to breed, pass on its genes. There's no reason for it to meet its end at my window. And so, not trying to be doom and gloom, but this is the most often ignored piece when folks are having a bird-friendly habitat. And so I really encourage you to do some research and try to address it. Okay, so while we're on doom and gloom, climate change. Now, we know that climate change is the #1 threat to birds and humans. These kids aren't even old enough to vote, but they are advocating for clean energy legislation. All of us can do this, and we really, really need to, because half of North American bird species are predicted to lose about half of their habitat range by the year 2080, which means, if you see on this map, we have, let me get out my little laser pointer. This is the approximate range of the Baltimore Oriole in the year 2000. This gray area is its predicted range by the year 2080, which shows that the Baltimore Oriole will no longer be found in Baltimore. And so you're already taking climate action by planting a garden. All of those plants are acting as a carbon sink, which is perfect. But when you plant a bird-friendly garden and you plant native plants and you do it in this way, you are not only planting a carbon sink, but you're also providing habitat to these species whose ranges are going to be reduced due to climate change. And then, of course, we want to learn as much as we can about the plants that are already growing in our landscapes, try to identify and remove invasives. eliminate the use of pesticides. We already talked about that. And of course, conserve water as best we can. Rain barrels are not so great to use for your vegetable gardens. You don't really want that water that's washed off of your roof touching the thing that you're going to eat, but rain barrels are perfect for your habitat gardens. So capture that water and use it to help your new native plants get established. After they're established, they don't really need a whole lot of watering after that. So let's start thinking about all the places where we can add habitat. I hear this phrase backyard habitat a lot, as if backyards are the only places where we can plant habitat gardens. But I mean, you saw the statistics. This is dire. And so we need not only backyard habitats, but side yard habitats and front yard habitats like these in Baltimore. Maybe you don't have a yard at all. No problem. You need a patio garden. Some of these are fully in the shade. There are native plants for that. Some of these are fully in the sun. There are native plants for that. If you have soil full of clay and rocks, there are native plants for that too. There are very few places on this earth that don't have any plants at all. Just keep that in mind. We want native plant gardens on our decks, on our balconies. We want them spilling out into your alleyways. Even if you don't have any garden space at all, you might have a window box or a tree pit or that little curb strip in between the sidewalk and the street. This is Anna in the bottom left here. She doesn't have land. She doesn't have a house. She doesn't have a window box. She lives on a boat and she still has a bird-friendly habitat. So if Anna can do it, then all of you can do it. Because keep in mind, you never know where that individual exhausted wood thrush is going to land. It might land on your bird-friendly houseboat. We love recognizing neighbors who have gotten to work. And so in Maryland and DC, you can earn an Audubon bird-friendly habitat sign. And we are so thrilled to see that this is really catching on. We started this program in Baltimore, but we were able to expand it across the state with the help of our Audubon chapters and volunteers. And so we encourage you, if you think about 70% of you said you think that you have a bird-friendly garden already. And so if you think you do, please go on our website and apply to get your Audubon habitat sign. Get yourself on the map and then look down at all your neighbors until they get their signs too. Peer pressure is fully supported. Okay, so it is already 8 o'clock, I realize. And so we've all learned about the whys. Why are we going to do this? Where are we going to do this? Everywhere, basically. But how about how? So I have some long-term goals for us. These are not the kinds of things that you are going to be able to do this weekend. Unless you have a very big budget, in which case we should talk because we rely on donations. And so I have 3 long-term goals that are hopefully going to just get you kind of in the right mindset and pointed in the right direction. Then we're going to make a plan. Okay. So instead of thinking, here's our first goal. Instead of thinking of where to put plants, I want you to instead think about where you want to do activities outside and where you want to walk in between those activity spaces. Those are going to be your outdoor rooms, and then everywhere else can be plants, okay? And that is how we are going to reduce the amount of lawn or paved surface that we have by half. That's our goal, okay? So we're trying to reduce the amount of impervious surface we have. We're trying to reduce the amount of mowed lawn we have and try to create these outdoor rooms. If you don't have a yard, that is okay. This is a container garden example. So our neighbor Teresa knew that she wanted to be able to come out of her back door. She has a dining area, and you saw her in the video dancing with her husband. She needs a dancing area and then access to her alley. But everywhere else is filled with containers of plants, including going up the walls. And I really do need to get an updated picture from her because this is an older photo and her garden has like exploded. It's amazing. So, give me 1 second. Okay, Our second goal is to plant densely in layers. And this is actually kind of two goals that I smushed into one, sorry. So we want to plant densely. We want plants to be as close together as possible to create that important shelter for birds. And then we also want to plant in as many layers as possible. And this is essentially what's going to help to create your outdoor rooms, these layers. So the ground covers create the floor, and then your shrubs create the walls, and then your arching limbs create the ceiling of your outdoor rooms. I chose this image specifically for this slide because I think it demonstrates that really well. This is why we want to do this, because the number of layers of vegetation that you have in your garden is actually the biggest contributor to animal biodiversity that will be able to live there, not the number of different species of plants that you have. I mean, I'm sure that's a factor, but it's not as big of a factor as the number of layers of vegetation. And that's because each one of those layers equals niches, equals spaces for organisms to occupy. And so if you have a canopy layer, that provides niches for all of your raptors and your flycatchers, those species that need somewhere to perch and look for their prey. If you have the ground cover layer, then you'll have your thrushes and your towies and your sparrows, all of those ground foraging birds, okay? You are creating niches. In between, in the understory and the shrub layer is where all of your hummingbirds and your woodpeckers and your goldfinches, all of the other species are going to hang out. So try to get as many different layers in your garden as possible. This is actually that same garden, just looking a different direction. And I can see her ground cover layer, which allows her garden to sort of smoothly transition down into her mowed pathways. Her understory layer, shrub layer, these small trees are the next layer, and then these large canopy trees. If you want to do a real deep dive into layers, come to the next workshop, the sort of second level workshop. Ooh, we should call it the second layer workshop. So that's where we will talk a lot more about how to use these different layers of gardening to design a bird-friendly plant community. There are ways to imitate these layers of vegetation in containers. One container can have several different plants in it. You can put a shrub or a tall grass in the middle, surrounded by shorter things, and then finally the like these kind of trailing, spilling species that spill over the edges. And so even if you don't have a yard, you can still mimic these layers of vegetation in containers. And then our final goal, or maybe sort of a guiding principle, is to avoid the plant zoo. So we don't just want to plant like one of each thing. It makes it really hard for especially insects to find their host plants, but other animals as well. So we don't just want to plant specimens of things. We actually want to plant species in clusters. 3 Asclepias tuberosa, that's that butterfly weed that you saw the monarch eating, is much more likely to attract a monarch butterfly than one. Although I will say, the first milkweed plant that I ever planted in my yard was gifted to me by another gardener, and it had monarch caterpillars on it. One milkweed plant will make a difference, but even better to have 3 or 5. Designers like to work in odd numbers. The reason for this has to do with the foraging efficiency of pollinators and birds, right? So an insect like a bumblebee is going to go to the same species of flower over and over and over. And so if you cluster the same species next to each other, it's going to be able to do that a lot more efficiently than if it were going here and then all the way over here and kind of back and forth and wasting a lot of time and energy. This is a small garden here, but you can still see the layers, right? This all one species here clustered, the next highest species. This is actually a circular garden, so the tallest species are in the middle. I think this is another good example. This is called massing or drifting, planting all of the same species in a clump and then filling in with those ground covers. Okay, so normally at this point in this workshop, when we are in person with folks, we hand out a bunch of graph paper and colored pencils, and I try to sort of guide us through making a plan for our gardens. It's not to say that you can't change things up and take advantage of that free milkweed that your friend wants to give you, but it's good to have a plan in order to put those long-term goals into practice. So we can't do that together tonight, but I'm giving you some homework. I hope that you're not upset that I'm giving you some homework, but here's our plan. Ideally, you can use graph paper because those little squares help to make things like relatively to scale. It doesn't have to be perfect. But I think it's really handy because I can sort of imagine that each little square is a square foot. And I want to put at least one herbaceous plant, not like our shrubs and trees that take up more space, but one herbaceous plant per square foot. So if you can get some graph paper from an office supply store, very easy to get your hands on, you can try to do that. So once you map out your property, you're going to add in your activity areas. So I mentioned that we're creating these outdoor rooms. And so this is anything like, dining, or we have a dining area here, we have a sitting area here. Maybe you want to have a veggie garden over here. And then also put on your map anything that's existing and that's not moving. Okay, so this shed or your patio or these large plantings. Okay, so you're going to map all that out. Then you are going to connect those activity areas with pathways. And it's really completely up to your aesthetic as to how you want these pathways to look. I kind of like these kind of curving pathways in a more naturalized garden because we don't typically see like right angles in nature. But if you want to have a very formal garden and fill it with native plants, I mean, by all means, the birds don't care what it looks like, right? So we have our activity areas, then we're going to join them by paths. And this is what I want you to actually sketch out on your map that you're creating. And that's because now I can start to see that everywhere else are places that I can put plants. That's where I'm going to start to form the walls of my outdoor rooms. And I would like to encourage you to work out from the edges when you're doing this. I just think it helps to sort of plan as opposed to creating islands in the middle. Because you can put your tallest plants at the back and then you can kind of slowly transition down to the mowed paths, right? So working from the edges and then slowly working your way in. It is highly possible, probably likely, that you are not going to do all of this gardening in 1 year. I've been slowly coming out from the edge of my garden, from the edge of my property a little bit every year. So I'm slowly adding kind of like another foot each year, just as your budget allows. Same steps if you're thinking about a patio garden. So you have your activity area, you have your pathways that are connecting all of your kind of points of entry or your access points. So this is what you end up with, this kind of map with your pathways and your activity areas. Even in a small space like this, it can be easy to get overwhelmed by trying to decide what kind of plant I can put in all of these areas that I've just decided I can put plants in. And so I want you to think about each area of your garden as a different microhabitat. Your entire property is likely a collection of microhabitats. And so you can zoom in on one spot and just think about that spot and all of the different conditions that exist in that microhabitat in order to help you choose the plants, or maybe one plant, that can fit in that spot. And so that's what we're going to do right now. So I'm going to zoom in on this one spot, and I want to know as much as I can about this one spot so that I can choose the plant that will thrive there. Okay, so we're not just willy-nilly going to the nursery and buying what looks the prettiest. Like, we have a plan. We know all the different things that are going to impact what plant can live there. And so that's going to be determined by things like directionality, topography, things that already exist there, like buildings and other plants. Think about this zoomed in spot right here. I've shown that this spot is against a north facing wall. Okay, so we're in the northern hemisphere. That means the sun is going to rise in the east, but it's going to kind of arch to the south. Okay, and so against this north facing wall, it might not get very much sun during the day at all, as opposed to this spot over here against the south facing wall, it's going to get a lot of sun. So two completely different microhabitats that are going to need different kinds of plants. Some more questions to ask yourself. I realize this is a text heavy slide, but that's what the recording is for. So don't feel like you have to scramble to get all of this written down. So you're going to want to ask yourself things like how much sun that spot gets. Typically, when you buy plants, they're sort of categorized as either full sun or full shade or somewhere in the middle. And I realize that can be kind of confusing. So you should think about it like this. Full sun means that spot gets 6 or more hours of sun in a day. Part shade, part sun is 2 to 6 hours. And then full shade is less than 2 hours. Okay. And remember, if you are planting your garden in layers, things that are lower to the ground are going to get shaded by taller plants, right? So we talk a lot more, like I mentioned, about these layers in the more advanced bird-friendly garden design workshop. So if you want to learn more about that, make sure you sign up for that workshop. There's only one left this spring. You're going to think about how much space there is. I mentioned that I like to crowd my herbaceous plants, my perennials, together, but you need room for the full size of shrubs and trees. So they need room to grow. Think about how wet the soil is. Dry means there are no signs of moisture in the soil. Make sure you're not looking like right after it rains, right? So typically, assuming no rain, no signs of moisture means that area is dry. Moist means the soil looks and feels damp, like all the time. Wet means it's saturated. It's like a wetland. Okay, so please don't buy a red twig dogwood that lives in a wetland and plant it in your container, unless it's like a special cultivar or something. It's not going to thrive there. Okay, we have to think about how this plant might affect your neighbors, unless you hate your neighbors, in which case skip that question. But you're not going to want to plant things that are going to flop over on the sidewalk. If you live in Baltimore, you're going to get a citation for that. I'm an expert on that now. We just did a training for the Department of Housing, but I learned so much. Thorny plants, right? They're going to poke people. Fragile plants that are going to get stepped on. Try to think through all of these things. And then finally, I realize I'm like beating this to death when I say, thinking about what plant species are native. I want us to think about local ecotypes. So I just mentioned the word cultivars. There's still a wide range of variation in what horticulturists and suppliers will label as native. And so if you are, holding a plant that is native to the United States, but not native to your particular region, what that means is that you're actually looking at a cultivar of that plant that has been, genetically bred to make it more winter hardy, okay? There are lots of different kinds of cultivars. People breed plants for lots of different qualities. The local ecotype and the straight species is always going to be best. But if you, find a species that is bred to be more compact, or if it's bred to have a longer bloom time, those kinds of things can be really helpful and sometimes necessary. So just something for you to keep in mind. If you have questions about these kinds of things, if you see a cultivar at a nursery, please do ask the nursery managers about that. They should welcome your questions and want to help explain it to you. I mean, they're trying to help, they're trying to sell you plants, right? If they don't seem like they want to answer your questions, then you probably don't want to buy plants from them. So, first task is to understand your site conditions. Ask yourself all of those questions about where you want to put this plant. And then, there's still a really wide range of species out there. And so hopefully you can use these top 10 lists that we've developed. They are on our website. I'll show you where to find them. But they can really help you narrow down your choices by listing the most productive groups of plants for wildlife. So if you have the space and budget for trees, it lists the oaks at the top because they support over 500 different species of butterfly and moth caterpillars. Among the herbaceous plants, the goldenrod supports some 125 species. And so hopefully you'll be able to use these lists to help you kind of narrow down and choose the most ecologically beneficial species. Several other different resources where you can search for and filter for the types of plants that you might want to plant. Audubon has a native plant database where you can type in your zip code and it will generate a list of plant species that are native to your area. And you can actually filter by the types of birds that you might want to attract. So if you want to attract hummingbirds or orioles, you can enter that in as a filter and get a list of plants. Another cool thing about this website for folks, especially who are joining us from outside the region, is that there's a local resources tab. So once you click that search button and you see your list of plants at the top, look for the tab that says local resources. And that's going to tell you if you have Audubon centers or chapters nearby, if they have a habitat recognition program. It's also going to list native plant nurseries in your area. So that's a really neat website to check out. I also love the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center website. Under the native plants tab, if you click search for plants, you can put in your state and then filter by almost everything you can imagine. I like to filter by height and bloom time, so that I can make sure that I have something that blooms in the spring and the summer and the fall. So that's a really great resource. And then, of course, our own website is chock-a-block full of things that you can download. Go to the conservation tab and click bird friendly communities. If you scroll to the bottom, you will see downloadable PDFs for seasonal maintenance guides. What kinds of things should I be doing in my garden in the spring and in the fall? There are downloadable garden templates. If you just don't even know where to start, you just want someone to draw it out for you, you can find those there. Lots of different resources to be found there. So with that, I'm going to let Susie wrap us up before we do some Q&A.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Please type in a few more questions. Erin, I have a short list of things for you already, but I know more will come in while I'm talking. A few quick reminders. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this collective effort on conservation. And so, as you heard in the beginning, but I know several came late, so I'll reiterate, you will get a link to this recording of today's webinar. There's a follow-up email that Erin will send tomorrow. It also includes a link to a survey. Please do take a couple minutes to give us your feedback. Also, you will get links to many of the things I've been sharing in the chat, in particular, the bird-friendly gardening resources that we have developed and have on our website. That includes the application for the sign in Maryland and DC. That includes the top 10 lists. There's some other downloadables. We talked about berries for birds in the chat. Those things can all be found from that page, including many in a printable format. Also, I encourage you, if you are able, COVID has been rough on all of us in one way or another, and in some cases, many ways. But we do appreciate your support. If you are able to make a donation to Patterson Park Audubon Center, we appreciate that local support. While it is exciting to be part of National Audubon Society, we have to raise all those funds locally so we can offer these free programs. So I will drop that link in the chat momentarily. I also sent a couple times through the chat the link to the next webinar. I can do that again. It will also be, Erin, in the follow-up email. Yes, the link for May 13th.
The link to sign up for the other workshop? No, it's not in the follow-up email that I sent. You'll have to go to here. I can actually show folks on our website. If you go to this programs and events tab, and then from the menu that drops down, click on upcoming events. That's where you'll see the other workshops that you can register for.
Perfect. Yes, and other activities. If you're in the area, we are doing some activities in person in small groups and all that good stuff. We've got our COVID guidelines and that's all there. So do join us again. Do invite a friend to do the same. And I will turn it back over to Erin and prompt her with some questions. I'm putting in the donation link right now. And then, Erin, let me give you your first question. Spotlight yourself, please. Back to you, and I'll just feed you a couple things. And I see more coming in the chat. Let me catch up here first. All right, first question. Oh, I know you'll like this one. How do I deal with poison ivy? Erin's favorite. Poison ivy without poisoning the birds is the question.
Yeah. I used to be really cocky about this question, like just put on your big girl pants and go like rip it out. And then I did that last summer and I got covered with poison ivy and I had to go on steroids. So very carefully is all I can say. Like, I don't know. I did it manually, and in theory, if you are gloved and long sleeved and pantsed and maybe socks even covering your pants, you know, you can do that. It actually does come up pretty easily, assuming it's like a moderately sized stem. I thought that I was being super careful, you know, took off all of my clothes when I got home. It's best to wash off with cold water because warm water opens your pores and allows the oils to get in. I did all of these things and I still somehow got covered in it. So I'm clearly not the person to ask. If it is a larger vine and it's growing up the side of a tree, I imagine you could tackle it similarly to English ivy, where you can kind of use a saw to cut a section of it, just being careful of the tree. And, you know, if you cut out kind of a section of the vine, eventually it will die and you can remove it. But if it's somewhere where it's not creating a hazard to you or your neighbors, like if this is one of you many acres folks, I will just mention that it is a native plant and it does have berries for birds, but I can attest to its toxicity. I don't have any other advice besides just being really careful and then getting some Tecnu, which is, I think it's spelled TECNU. It's a soap that specifically removes oils. Yeah.
So folks have, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but yes, folks have giving their own suggestions, and that was one of them.
Yeah. I used to use Tecnu a lot when I was in graduate school, but I don't have any right now. I should probably get some.
Sounds like perhaps. Okay, there are more coming in the chat. Let me feed you the next question in the queue. There was a question about mulch and how does it affect caterpillars?
Okay, yeah, we do talk a little more about mulch in the next workshop because that's how you prepare the space that you're going to plant. That's how you can remove turf grass by putting down mulch. It's a really good question. What I typically do is, you know, I mentioned that I'm kind of like working on my garden, you know, 1 foot strip at a time. And how I do that is by putting down a thick layer of mulch in the fall, or at least like 6 months before I want to plant in that spot. So that's to suffocate the turf grass underneath. And then in the spring or whatever season it is that I'm going to plant, I plant those things, and then I never mulch again. So I only actually ever put down mulch in a bed that I'm planting one time. And that is when I am first establishing the bed in order to remove the turf grass. If you don't need to do that, then you don't need mulch. What I usually do in the very late winter, early spring, when it's like reliably 50s and 60s out, is cut all of your dried herbaceous stems back, and or if you have a larger property, you might have to actually mow them, and kind of mulch those up and use those as mulch, and use the leaves that fall as mulch. I like to think about my garden maintenance in terms of when nature does that maintenance. So when does nature mulch? In the fall, when it drops all of the leaves. When does nature fertilize or add compost? In the spring, when all of those leaves and everything is decomposing and turning into compost. So yeah, because you're not only preventing perhaps like insects that have overwintered underground from being able to surface, but you're also preventing plants from reseeding themselves, which you might want to do. You want your plants to kind of fill in. So if you mulch too heavily, those seeds aren't going to be able to reach the ground. They aren't going to be able to germinate.
Thank you. Questions about how to best get rid of grass. There were some suggestions like the cardboard method. Didn't you? I can't remember which ones you tend to highlight, but if there's another way you want to elaborate.
Yeah, exactly what I just described. I don't use, I don't use cardboard. Actually, I've sort of found it an unnecessary step. I mow that area of turf grass down as low as I can. I'm basically like scalping the grass off of the surface of the ground. And then I put like 6 inches of as big of pieces of mulch as you can find. I use the pine bark nuggets. I realize that the pine might like create some acidity. I haven't found it to be a problem, but as big of pieces of mulch as you can. Put down a really thick layer, 6. It's gonna feel like, is this too much? But it's not, because that will suffocate the grass, the turf grass, and whatever other weeds are growing. At least 6 months. I usually do this in the fall. It's tricky because stores don't sell mulch in the fall. They sell it now. They have parking lots full of it now, but in the fall, it's a lot harder to find. But that's when nature mulches. So that's when I put down my mulch. I let it sit all winter long. It gets snowed on. All of the turf grass dies. And then in the spring, I, clear a space, plant my plant, done.
I apologize if I am asking something that you have just said. I'm trying to, there's a lot coming through in the chat, trying to read.
Yeah, no, understood. They were like different but related questions.
Okay. There have been a couple questions actually about creating a meadow, native meadow, of course. Would you recommend where to go to find resources, a bit more about that and how to manage it?
So a book that I love is Garden Revolution by Larry Weiner. And he first springs to mind because he's known as the meadow guy. And he thinks so carefully about the succession of plants, like which plants to plant first so that they will later get shaded by other plants and be able to occupy like a very close space to each other while not competing with each other. It's very fascinating. If you're able to get a hold of his book or go to any talks that he gives. But the sort of critical thing to remember about planting meadows is that layering. And we talk about that a lot more in the next workshop about, how you can plant, shorter rooted things next to taller rooted things so that you can plant them really closely to each other so that they look like a meadow.
Okay. Um, All right, we've got a couple bug questions, your favorite topic.
Favorite.
First, aphids and how to deal with them, how to manage aphids. And cicadas, do we need to worry? What should we think about for small trees, for example?
Yeah, I can't wait to talk about the cicadas, but I'll tackle the aphids first. So I've had, aphid outbreaks in my garden too. It means that I don't have enough natural enemies around to suppress that pest outbreak. And so what do I need? More natural enemies. How do I get those? More native plants. There are other ways to deal with it. There are like organic ways to deal with it. You can spray with soapy water, neem oil. I really try not to do any of those things because I want my garden to be able to take care of itself. Also, it could be because I'm lazy, but I truly want my garden to be able to take care of itself. And so I need more things like ladybugs and parasitic wasps, those teeny, teeny, tiny parasitoids that are going to take care of aphids. So I don't know if I have like a more specific suggestion than that, but we all experience it. They're very common on milkweed. You'll just see like tons of, it's like the top of the milkweed plant has turned yellow because it's covered in aphids. As long as they're not damaging your plants more than usually like 10% is kind of the threshold when folks start to get worried. If your plant is damaged more than 10%, that's usually the time when people will start to take action in some way. Less than that, it's kind of a perspective shift and sort of being okay with a little bit of insect damage on your plants, and then just doing everything that you can to welcome more natural enemies. I love the cicada question. I'm so excited about this. I did not live in Maryland the last time that we had an emergence. So the reason I'm excited is because it's just like a cool natural phenomenon, but also they are going to be gobbled up by so many birds and other animals. When I said that insects have lots of protein, cicadas are like up there and they're like 75% protein. So everything's going to be eating them. It's going to be awesome. They do have the potential to damage young woody plants. And that is because the females will deposit their eggs under the bark on a twig. And that twig can kind of die and break off like this. It's called flagging. And they are looking for twigs about the width of a pencil up to a 1/2 inch diameter. So if you have a big, huge tree, a small percentage of the branches on that big, huge tree are going to be the size that the cicada is looking for. And it can actually be a good thing for a mature tree to shed some of those dead and dying branches. So that's fine. If you have a young tree where all of its branches are that size, you might want to protect it by covering it with some netting. You just have to make sure that the holes in the netting are small enough that the cicadas can't get through. So I would say about 1/4 inch. But I'm not super worried about it. Maybe this is going to be like when I wasn't super worried about the poison ivy and I'm going to rue the day. But we shall see. If you're worried about it, you can cover your trees with netting. But I'm hoping that even trees that are smaller, if you think the tree can lose 50% of its branches and still be alive. Okay, that sounds extreme now that I said it out loud. But I'm thinking of like a 2-branch little tree, you should probably protect that. If it's like several years old and it might lose a few, I think it's okay. I'm mostly just really excited.
You can't hear me laughing. I was on mute. Okay.
What? What am I missing? Should I open the chat?
No, your enthusiasm for cicadas. That's
Oh,
The-
I've been learning so much about them this spring. I'm so glad that everyone's answering their questions because I've gotten to learn about it, and I'm really excited.
There's been a lively chat for the Q&A, so I appreciate all the questions and the shared expertise to handle and answer some of them. I don't know if you said it, but I was getting ready to type it myself regarding the netting on the plants. Just be careful because birds can get caught in them. So I don't know if you said that out loud, but someone else just typed it in as well.
I did not say that out loud, so thank you for adding that.
And that's it. There aren't any more. So please wrap us up. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. I'll just say thank you, everybody, for coming and just delighting me with your questions. I will send out an email tomorrow that will include a link to the recording and a link to a survey, which you did actually already receive. I would love your feedback on that while it's all fresh, and some other kind of odds and ends. So keep a lookout for that tomorrow. And then if you are so inclined, please sign up for the Next Level workshop. There's only one date left and they do tend to fill. So head on over to our website to sign up for that, and hopefully we will see you again. For now, good night. Thanks so much for coming.